My name is Joshua Silva. I am a licensed commercial pilot and flight instructor. I have had a lifelong love of aviation and aerospace, and when growing up I even fancied myself an amateur astronomer. I would drag my family and friends, anybody I could, to every air show I could possibly find in Northern California. I was the only kid you knew, or anybody knew, that knew the various components on aircraft, spacecraft by heart. I absolutely loved anything to do with flying or space. But my love of aviation and aerospace never stopped. I continued studying, had an entire library full of aviation books of various military and civilian aircraft, military history, every aviation campaign and theater in almost any war. I studied religiously, and it was just out of pure passion. Later in life, many years later, I decided to become a pilot. As strange as it may sound, it hadn't occurred to me to become a pilot up to that point. I just simply loved aviation and aerospace, but I decided to become a pilot, and I began attending a prestigious flight academy in the Midwest and attending university at the same time, and to gain a degree in aeronautics and aerospace. Shortly thereafter, I began flying twin turboprop aircraft out of Northern California for several nonprofit organizations, and years after that I found myself flight instructing for various small flight schools, both in California and in Arizona, and then on to large academies that trained for the airlines and even some military flights. Shortly thereafter, I began flying regional business jets, and that's when the story of me finding the topic of flat Earth started. Could the Earth actually be flat? I began to see opinions and arguments that seemed logical, but I heard several arguments, which I now know were most likely disinformation, easily disprovable in the aviation world, but there were some that stuck with me. And so, myself being the way I am, I ran quickly, metaphorically, to my old textbook, and I opened my old textbooks, found them, unpacked them, cracked them all open, and even downloaded brand new copies in PDF form offline of all these books to make sure that nothing had been changed. I thought for certain that I knew exactly what compensation pilots are trained while flying to compensate for the spin or the rotation of the Earth, for instance. As far as falling around a globe, I assumed in my mind would be an aircraft's angle of attack, but upon more study I found that not to be true. The angle of attack being the angle between the aircraft's flight path and the relative wind, which is something that pilots are very familiar with, and it's the idea that an aircraft has to be slightly pitched up, essentially to stay airborne, or a surface of that aircraft has to be pitched slightly to create a difference in air pressure to hold the aircraft aloft. And that is assumed, or was assumed at that time by myself and other pilots, to be the compensation one would make for falling around a globe while flying, period. But upon further research, I found that this was not the case, and it was not even mentioned anywhere. This compensation was not mentioned anywhere I could find in any resource that I had gone to flight school with, and they were extensive. There were many, many books, especially as one progressed towards the commercial flying side, especially elective courses, especially if you're going to university as I was studying aerospace, then you would assume, and I had assumed, that this was calculated for. The big one that is oftentimes quoted is compensation for Coriolis effect while flying. And this is something I'd even taught my students about, and it's always assumed to be correct. We just assume. We're given the narrative from a young age, and everything is built upon that assumption, upon the theory. And so I thought I had the silver bullet. Coriolis effect. We always calculate for that. Well, as I began to look through the books and to look into the calculations given for Coriolis effect, the narrative began to fall apart even further. I began to see things I didn't notice when I was in school, such as Coriolis effect is actually never calculated for, but is assumed to be a part of wind correction angle. Wind correction angle is one of the many calculations pilots of all kinds make while flying to correct against winds in whatever volume or section of air they're flying through, which it could be from any direction, and you're flying through it, so you have to compensate a certain angle into that wind to hold a straight line. And then the big one is given after that. Well, GPS auto corrects for it. And that sent me down yet another path. GPS auto corrects for it. If it's a satellite-based system, how is it correcting for spin if it's also spinning over the same body? And why are there large gaps in GPS coverage over large oceanic bodies? Do they just turn them off? It's just not worthwhile? There have been enough aviation accidents at sea, very far from shore, that would say otherwise. And if you gave the American taxpayers, the ones funding these satellites that are supposed to track aircraft, the information that, well, we're just shutting them off because it's not worthwhile, those 3 or 4 jets full of hundreds of passengers just have to use other navigation methods such as dead reckoning, which is basically using a stopwatch and guessing to the next checkpoint, essentially. If you were to tell them that, they would be infuriated. So that could not be the case. Coverage was a problem. Even over large and non-densely populated areas, you would lose GPS coverage, even in jets at times. So this began to unravel the thread of satellites and satellite timing, and the fact that many reels of footage show these satellites being launched by balloon rather than by rockets. How the concept of these rockets doesn't even work to make it past the atmosphere, much less leave something in perfect geosynchronous orbit. I actually had the privilege of working a short time at a satellite manufacturing company in Northern California. Got to see the assembly and participate in the assembly of satellites, space-based satellites, or so they were said. There would be small bottles encased in these structures that were encased by another structure. The small bottles were the fuel cells. These fuel cells were incredibly small, smaller than a diver's tank in most cases, much smaller. And this was supposed to be all the fuel that the craft needed to run and operate, as most are not actually electric, they're becoming electric now, and sustain itself in a perfect orbit by just small bursts from its engine or its propulsion system. The narrative began to fall apart. I would continue studying and finding that what I fear to be true is reality, that we have been lied to about just about everything. Upon researching military history and then military training and speaking with military gunners in both the Army and the Marine Corps that I know personally, I would ask them about Coriolis effect. And it was always assumed that, yeah, we compensate for the Earth being, a curve, that it would drop. We calculate for the Earth curvature. But even upon asking and having them look into their materials further and my own personal study, again, it found to be an assumed truth with no actual basis in reality, that they would calculate bullet fall based upon angular velocity, drop, friction, amongst other things, and curvature was supposed to be just corrected along with it, just like flying, wind correction angle corrected for Coriolis effect.